Hi, welcome to the study on the question of holiness. I'm excited that you've chosen to join me in looking closely at what the Bible teaches about God's purposes for all of us. Now you may be wondering, what's the question exactly? Well, the central question is this: what does it mean to be holy? And that question invites us to consider other questions along with it. How holy can we reasonably expect to become? How does it happen? What does holiness look like in our day-to-day lives? And why does holiness matter at all? These are the kinds of questions we'll consider in each session of this study. We'll look at them from different angles. We'll consider how different texts of Scripture in both the Old Testament and the New Testament speak to these questions. Now, different people have different assumptions about the word holy. Those assumptions aren't always helpful, and it may help us to name some of those up front. For some, holiness smacks of legalism. It's parents or pastors or teachers who require us to act in certain ways and avoid certain other behaviors. If you follow their rules, you're holy. If not, you're not. As we'll see later, the problem with that understanding of holiness is that the Bible frames holiness as the transformation of our character. Yes, that issues forth in certain behaviors. Yes, it impacts the way we live in relation to God and others. But holiness isn't primarily behavior modification. It's much, much deeper than that. I've met other people who think of holiness exclusively as an attribute of God. God is holy, but we're not. And in their minds, we can never be holy. The difficulty with that view is that Scripture frequently calls the people of God to be holy as God is holy. So whatever is meant in the Bible by holy, it's something God desires to share with us. Whatever you think of holiness, let me invite you to come to this study with an open mind, to discover the rich and varied ways that the Bible talks about holiness. What you find may surprise you. It may challenge your assumptions, and it will invite you to look at the concept of holiness from new angles and with fresh eyes. Before we look at any specific biblical texts, it will be helpful to preview a few things that will come up in the study. And the first one is this: there are lots of passages in the Bible that will impact our understanding of holiness, even though they don't use the specific word holy. Wrestling with the scriptural idea of holiness requires more than looking up all the times the word shows up in Scripture. The idea is present in a variety of texts, even when the word is not. We'll see this in our study of the opening chapters of Genesis. Holiness language only shows up there in relation to the Sabbath. It's not used in relation to human beings at all. Nevertheless, Genesis, in the early chapters, is all about God's purposes for us as creatures made in His image. And the very fact that we're made in God's image is relevant to the question of holiness. It opens our eyes to the fact that God made us to represent Him. And as His representatives, our lives always tell a story about who God is. When we sin, we represent God falsely. Our lives tell a lie about His character. When we live in ways that honor God, we represent God truly. Our lives tell the truth about God and about His character. When we live in ways that honor Him, our lives testify to the holiness of God. So right there, in the opening chapters of the Bible, we begin to get answers to the question of holiness, even though the word holiness hasn't come up yet. The second thing you need to know is that we'll use several different terms that arise out of Scripture to describe the same reality that we mean when we talk about holiness. We're talking about biblical terms like entire sanctification and Christian perfection. Those terms might seem quite surprising, but as we'll see, they represent the language of Scripture. And they also invite us to consider the extent of holiness that God desires to work in our lives. Remember that one of our questions is, how holy can we reasonably expect to become in this life? The biblical answer to that question may surprise you. A third thing to watch for is the relationship between worship, holiness, and mission. A lot of times when we talk about holiness, we think almost exclusively in terms of individual, personal, spiritual formation. And that's a big part of it. But the implications of holiness stretch far beyond my individual experience of it. In Scripture, we find that holiness is grounded in the worship of God, and true worship cultivates authentic holiness. We also find, and this is a major theme, that Scripture treats holiness as essential to effective mission. Our mission to bring the good news about Jesus to our neighbors and the nations will be severely hindered if our lives don't tell the truth about God. So keep your eyes open for passages of Scripture that link holiness and mission. Fourth, we need to recognize that when we neglect the biblical teaching on holiness, we sell the gospel short. What do I mean by that? Only this. Sometimes we talk about the gospel or the good news as being only about God's unmerited favor that offers us forgiveness of sin. The gospel does do that, but it does much, much more. The gospel offers us the promise of salvation, and salvation is more than forgiveness. Salvation encompasses the whole work of God to draw us to Himself, to forgive us, to give us new life, to free us from the power of sin, and to enable us to live consistently to His honor. Sanctification is the process of becoming holy, and that process is very much included in the biblical language of salvation. This also impacts our understanding of grace. Grace is not merely God's undeserved favor. Grace is the power of God that dynamically transforms our lives so that we can faithfully embody God's character. So those are just a few of the things that you'll want to be watching for as we consider the question and all the questions that circle around the biblical language of holiness. Now let me share with you my hope for your study of the question of holiness. My chief hope is that this study of holiness in the Bible will be an instrument in the hand of God for your own growth, your own formation, your own sanctification, as you come to increasingly embody God's own character of holy love.